To start, in order not to engage in this Yankee imperialism, I was asked to keep it at 8 minutes. I will, because we have stayed out of this fight for so long and are apparently returning to it, I'll ask for an indulgence of 10 minutes, but I ask the indulgence of the Europeans for this, to explain something that is very, very important. It's happened in front of our eyes. And I think it's something that everyone has to take into consideration, what has happened in the United States. Before 2009, both Republicans and Democrats, whether a Republican administration or Democratic administration, all the Congresses that we've had, Republican run or Democratic run, all have been essentially Euro-Atlanticists. In fact, our great geostrategists, including Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, Euro-Atlanticists, committed Euro-Atlanticists. That is, hoping to see a day when Europe would be whole, free, and prosperous. Some have actually even gone on to dream of the idea of a global league of democracies. My professor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, wrote a book about that, The Grand Chessboard, in which he thought that if democracies were to flourish throughout the world, Kant's perpetual peace might break out, because democracies don't go to war with democracies. But something happened between January 2009 and September 2013. I have mentioned it to this august assembly 2 years running, and I just will very quickly in 2 minutes repeat what I had said. During that time, between 2009 and 13, the Euro-Atlantic consensus in America began to unravel. It actually broke into 4 pieces, not just 2, but 4. The Euro-Atlantic proper, or the right wing, I guess, the one that stayed, conserved the idea of the Euro-Atlantic idea, John McCain and his friends in the Senate, still were committed to a Europe whole, free, and prosperous. In fact, things like the European Partnership or the Eastern Partnership were seen as halfway houses to having all the different countries move into Europe eventually, and possibly leaving the notion of NATO membership open to all those countries. Then there was the Euro-Atlantic left. This began to see things slightly differently. They were committed to NATO and Europe and the European Union, but they began to waffle, we can see it, began to waffle on the question of Europe, of the Eastern partnerships and Southern partnerships and so on. They began to also see the Russians as a possible partner in, you would have to find the Russians having a discretion in terms of how these countries in the Eastern partnerships would develop. And so one sees that there you begin to see the outlines of something called the reset button. Russia could be used as a partner in other things, Iran, and other issues, the issues against terrorism and so on. Then in both the European Atlantic left and on the European Atlantic right, you see on the margins on the right, you began to see the appearance of what was called the return of Republican isolationism. Under Buchanan, it was Fortress America, but eventually it was, you had Ron Paul and Rand Paul bringing the libertarian idea that America has just wasted its time with all these wars and that it ought to come back home. America, come back home. That's on the right. On the left, you had also a development which is known as the progressives, or actually in some unkind quarters, third world progressives. These were folks then who basically looked at Europe as an old home for old imperial powers, and said Europe could take care of itself. There's not that much left to do there. Let's turn our eyes to Asia and Africa. And we know that there was, that pivot actually did happen. The result is that the US establishment no longer seemed fully committed to a Europe whole and free, or at least it seemed not to. Now, one could argue, and one in US establishment circles has argued, that Putin took advantage of that. Seeing that the United States was not committed, and obviously the United States brought some of the security issue for the Euro-Atlantic community, because Europe and the European Union did not have its own security structure. What essentially happened is that Putin took advantage of it, tried to push around Yanu, who was already a reluctant player vis-a-vis Europe, pushed him around and pushed him right over the cliff. In fact, had the country rebel against him. Once that happened and Putin couldn't hold Yanu in place, we received what Putin did. We can debate back and forth what he did, but he certainly moved on Crimea and began to talk about New Russia. What was the first reaction? And this is very important because this is the second stage of American politics. What was the reaction in American politics? The reaction was, in fact, a worsening of the Euro-Atlantic rift. We find that on the Euro-Atlantic left, my professor is big, Brzezinski suddenly is talking about, well, we must begin to consider what the Russians are doing. Is it possible, man, that we have gone too far in the European partnership? In fact, have we gone too far with the whole question of Ukraine? And is it possible that we need to Finlandize Ukraine? I tell everybody, well, ask the Finns and the Swedes now who are begging to join NATO. Maybe we should Finlandize Ukraine. But anyway, on the left, the Euro-Atlantic left. On the Euro-Atlantic right, very quickly, notice I'm speed Englishing to make sure that I get under 10 minutes. On the European right, what we get is even worse. Henry Kissinger, who had been a solid rock on the right, suddenly falls back to his Nixonian a great power of politics or realism position and starts saying, you know, we should really be treating the Russians as a great power. We should understand, you know, bottom line is it's not just about Finlandization of Ukraine. Maybe, you know, Crimea really never really belonged to Ukraine. Hell, even that Novorossiya idea, we've got to consider, you know, the Russians' feelings. And this is someone, a geostrategist on the right. But that realism then marries itself to the isolationist element that we were seeing. As I said, the third element that we were seeing with Rand Paul and with Pat Buchanan and his isolationism in general. And this realism began to start with Mearsheimer in the United States, began to push the position that, hell, we've even gone too far on everything. We've gone too far on Eastern Europe generally. Why were we so fast to put defense units into Eastern Europe and so on and so forth? Are we doing that? Should we be doing that? And that was then joined by the progressives, this fourth element that I told you, that went even further and said, people like Sam Charap and Steve Cohen said, yes, you antagonized, the Russians were antagonized from the very beginning, from 1991. They were never given a chance to become a partner in all of this. Look at what we've done. Jesus Christ, maybe we should not be very forthcoming, not only with the way we deal with Ukraine, but the way we deal with Eastern Europe generally. Now, this was a shock to all of us, but it in fact meant that there was absolutely no consensus on the Euro-Atlantic thing. Obama, who himself was pretty close to the progressives, but was not quite willing to take the progressive position openly, simply came up in May of 2014 after seeing what had happened to Ukraine, first with Yanu and then with Crimea. And he simply said, there is no solution, that there should be no antagonism with the Russians. There is no military option on the table. There is no military option on the table. And so, and in fact, he said, let's leave it all to the Europeans. In fact, let's leave it to what the Europeans are doing, especially the Germans. Let's look at negotiation and nothing but negotiation. Remember Geneva. Even before we had Minsk, we had Geneva. Now that leaves us to the third part, and I can do 3 and 4 very quickly now. 3 is when reality hit. Because reality hit after May, what it simply meant was that the Russians understood, man, that they had a free ride. Since the West, i.e. neither NATO nor EU were looking to be able to put up a wall against anything Russia's doing, then the Russians could accelerate military presence in Ukraine and nothing would happen. In fact, they did in May and June. The problem is that the Ukrainians, now understanding that, went the other direction, and they also escalated, and they started kicking a little rear end in June and July. Which means, and in fact so much so, that the Russians had to put these books in and shoot down innocent victims. The Russians, seeing that nothing happened with that, because their military option was still not on the table, then accelerated one more time and went for an invasion option. Well, let's be honest with the white convoys, and those white convoys were accompanied at midnight. I've seen the pictures, accompanied by midnight by green convoys that were coming in August. And that's why the Ukrainians had to eventually go back to the table in Minsk and seem to think. But you saw in Minsk that was not a ceasefire, nothing of the sort, escalation. But what's worse is that escalation by the Russians and the Ukrainians, and the Russians again, then escalates the world, and this is where the Americans got hit with it, and so did its allies. The escalation didn't stop with the Russians. It meant that ISIS now would escalate. It meant that the Iranians did not want to negotiate in seriousness about their nuclear option. It also meant that China could do whatever it wanted to in the Asian seas and oceans. Which meant that the West, even before the United States, and I can see it, Pani Pisarska, when you were sitting next to me. Yes, you in Poland, the Balts, the Swedes, the Finns, because we have an information network that we used. We were getting it from all of you. We were getting that, Jesus Christ, and this thing is catapulted. This is running out of control. It was absolutely running out of control. And in October, I think just about everybody in Washington understood that this was now going out of control. In effect, it wasn't just the Europeans that were telling us, it was the Aussies telling us that, it was the Canadians telling us that, because the Russians thought that the Arctic was, and made Canada the near abroad. So everybody began to realize that there's just a lot of aggression going out there because nobody's stopping anything. So guess what? The electorate in the United States saw that as well. The electorate, for the first time, instead of sitting out there doing Obamacare and all that other baloney that they always do, looking at their U.S. naval and nothing else in the world, they finally woke up and realized the foreign policy was going to a bad place. I was going to use a barnyard word, but I decided not to. It was going bad. And not only did that happen, but those crazy Ukrainians, and there are a lot of them, that there's at least 100,000 of them in 10 different states. And they used to, after Bush's suicidal nationalism speech, they used to vote for the Democrats, starting with Clinton. What they did is they decided to go the other way. And they polled the other diasporas, the Polish and the Lithuanian diasporas in Chicago. It was clear, and that's how Republicans elected an Illinois Republican governor. Anyway, the Republicans won. Which leads me to the last question of not what should our agenda should be, but what our agenda is becoming. And maybe that's what it should be, is what it's becoming. And I can wrap it up here. What essentially happens is, God love the elections. The elections indicated, that the Senate, the Congress were now in Republican hands. Better yet, 30 of the governorships, were now Republican hands. And the Republicans know that governors will probably be elected, not senators, but governors will be those elected the next president of the United States in 2016. Somewhere there you're going to find the next president. So, in effect, when that happened, I know that I missed the fact that IRI is not here, and I'm giving a little push for the Republicans. But it isn't so much the Republicans, because it wasn't just the Republicans. In November, in late November, it's not just the Republicans, it was conservative Democrats who had been Euro-Atlanticists. They too came on board. We saw that same diaspora that helped get new election results, that same diaspora, and I was part of those things as an NGO. I walked around with a lot of people. We found the end result was that an overwhelming number of senators, and now we're finding an overwhelming number of members of the House, are ready to come back to the Euro-Atlantic concept. They have voted, and I can now say it, would confirm it, both houses, and they have reconciled the two bills, the S-2828 and the H.R. 3159. They are now one bill, and they've now been submitted to Obama. Now he can veto, or he can try to pocket veto. But the pocket veto won't work because the Senate apparently is not very happy with him, on the left or the right, because of other things, including the budget. And so we're not sure he can actually pocket veto. We believe that if he can't pocket veto, it will in fact be legislation by the time the next Senate Congress comes, which in the first place is going to be on the side of giving weapons. Now, why is that important? I finish it with this. Obama will be authorized to give weapons. We're not sure Obama will give the weapons. But, and this is the important thing, while he may not give the lethal weapons as yet, the Russians know that the moment that they make a move on Mariupol or towards Crimea in the spring, those weapons are released, because he will not keep his office too well, or he won't get his nominations for any of his people, man, if he doesn't release it. But more important, he will now be urging to increase the other weaponry. And we now know the economic issue, sanctions, and further sanctions, including the SWIFT card. The SWIFT is the nuclear option. A second nuclear option is in the energy field. He can make that price go even further down. If it goes further down, if it goes to 50, a lot of people are telling me in the energy business in Houston, Russia will close down, not in 10 years or 5 years or 3 years, it will close down next year. And then the third...
Final sentence?
Yes, and the final sentence is non-lethal. All of that non-lethal weaponry, those radars and so on and so forth that can spot all those artillery units and mortars, are good enough to help the Ukrainians, because they seem to know how to fight a fight. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. We do have a large panel.